Civil rights groups are preparing to take the fight over sweeping changes to Georgia's voting process to court. The state's NAACP and several voting rights organizations filed a lawsuit Monday. It comes after Republican Governor Brian Kemp signed new restrictions into law last week. The measure includes new ID requirements, fewer ballot drop boxes, and shorter deadlines to request absentee ballots. The early voting period for runoff elections has also been cut down by a week. The bill will expand early voting hours for residents in more rural counties, something many metro areas already have in place. Republicans argue the overhaul will restore confidence in the integrity of Georgia's elections. This despite federal, state, and local officials repeatedly saying there was no evidence of widespread fraud in the 2020 election. For more, let's bring in Mark Niesse. He's a reporter for the Atlanta Journal-Constitution, where he covers Georgia's government. Welcome. Thanks very much for being with us. So this is the second federal lawsuit filed against this bill. President Biden said the DOJ is looking into getting involved. What is the basic argument against these new restrictions?
There are two basic arguments in the lawsuits. One is that these laws were passed with no justification, that since there wasn't evidence of widespread fraud in the November election, that these laws are not justified. The other argument in the NAACP lawsuit filed today is that these laws could have a disparate impact on minorities, Black voters, Asian American voters. All these voters might face higher hurdles to be able to vote under this bill, they argue in this lawsuit.
Former President Trump lost Georgia by just under 12,000 votes. Is it clear how many people this new law could potentially impact?
Well, it's clear that millions of people will feel the changes, like the absentee ballot ID requirements. Everybody will have to do that. Or early voting during runoffs. That will affect all the early voters. So a lot of people will be affected. The real question is how many people will be dissuaded from voting because of these laws. And that's a harder question to answer because most people will find a way to make sure their voice is heard. But there are some voters who this could discourage from going to the polls if they have to take extra steps.
Well, Georgia's Secretary of State Brad Raffensperger famously refuted former President Trump's claims of election fraud. How does the new law impact him? And what can you tell us about Raffensperger's potential future and standing within the GOP?
Well, he has lost popularity among the Republican Party as a result of the election in November. And this bill, which is now a law, removes him as chairman of the state election board. And so he will be replaced on the state election board by an appointee of the Georgia General Assembly. This bill also alters some of his powers in other ways, like if he does court settlements of election cases or makes any agreements with counties about adjusting how they run their elections as a result of investigations into complaints. All of that has to be reported to the Georgia General Assembly for their approval or disapproval before it can be enacted. And so all of these measures shift power from the Secretary of State's office to the Georgia legislature.
Well, last week, a video went viral showing Democratic State Representative Park Cannon being arrested. She was charged with 2 felonies for knocking on Governor Kemp's door while he delivered remarks on the new voting measure. Now, she returned to the State House Monday for the first time since her arrest. What did her return look like, and how is this incident being framed?
Well, this is a flashpoint moment. She was arrested very shortly after the bill was signed into law on Thursday. And now today at the Capitol, she was a leader in a protest both against this law governing election laws, but also it touches on so many things that we see protests around in terms of arrests and policing in Georgia and other communities. And so this is a big moment because it mobilizes people. It gives them something to, it's another way to argue against the law when it results in this kind of police action against a legislator. State Representative Park Cannon opposed this law, and then she was arrested and brought to the Fulton County Jail because of it.
And Mark, as you know, over the weekend, civil rights groups called on the PGA Tour and the Masters to boycott hosting their golf tournaments in the state. Major League Baseball players are also reportedly ready to discuss moving this year's All-Stars game out of Atlanta. Others are trying to pressure corporations to speak out against the law by calling for boycotts of companies like Coca-Cola. Yet some say boycotts could have unintended consequences. Tell us more about that boycott debate.
It's really interesting among voting rights groups and Democrats about whether they feel like companies should be boycotted, because you hear some messaging saying you don't want companies to leave Georgia for other states because of potential boycotts. You hear some advocates for voting rights saying, no, we want you to stay. We just want you to be a stronger business voice on election matters. And then you hear other organizations say we need to keep the pressure on these business groups. They are advocating for continuing to seek the chambers of commerce and Coca-Cola and sports teams to take a greater stance or a more strong stance on these election bills than they have so far. And there have been a series of statements issued by various businesses and business groups. But what voting rights advocates are saying is they need to do more, and they want these businesses to get more involved. And so now what we're seeing is a discussion about what is the best way to pressure these companies, because the voting rights advocates don't want the companies to necessarily leave Georgia, but they want them to be a critical part in the debate and put pressure on lawmakers and elected officials to protect voting rights.
And Mark, before we let you go, Fulton County's District Attorney Fani Willis is leading an investigation into former President Trump for possible violations of Georgia's election laws. What's the latest on that?
Well, the grand jury is meeting behind closed doors, we are told, and they are reviewing the evidence. We don't know what will come out of this or how far along the grand jury is in its investigation, but this investigation seems to be centered on President Trump's phone call to Secretary of State Brad Raffensperger in early January, when the president asked Raffensperger to find the votes that would put him over the top and erase his 12,000 vote deficit in Georgia. And the argument is, was that pressuring an election official? Was President Trump encouraging voting fraud, is the question that prosecutors are weighing. So this will play out in the coming weeks and months, and it's unclear whether charges will be brought or not.
All right, Mark Niesse for us. Mark, thank you very much.
Thanks for having me.